Okay, very excited to be joined here by Republican candidate for governor Christopher Kurka, Representative Christopher Kurka, and his running mate Paul Hueper. How you guys doing?
Awesome.
Doing great.
Thanks for having us.
We got to say, we'll start off by saying recently you broke your leg there, Paul, and
I did, and I can blame the campaign on that.
really, what happened?
Well, we're doing a statewide tour all the way from really Homer to Fairbanks, and we did a pass down by Albuquerque, and I made the mistake of standing on a spare tire that only had
Albuquerque.
one bolt. I'm sorry?
Albuquerque.
Moose Pass.
Moose
Moose
Pass.
Pass. We were talking about New Mexico before. You guys are going way down there.
No, it was Moose Pass. We've been everywhere. We've been in Seward, Moose Pass, Saldana.
You guys have this big
Valdez.
bus
Yes.
with your Kurka Hueper, and it's really big. It's like a real school bus or old school bus.
Yep, old Valdez school bus.
So you fell out, you fell, or you were?
Yeah, I was standing on a spare tire on a trailer, and we built this trailer that's got two large billboards on both sides, 10 feet by 20. And I thought, well, I've got a little bit more work to do up there. So I went up and stood on the spare tire, and the spare tire spins, funny enough. There's only one bolt that's going to spin.
So you just came back from the hospital. You got the new cast on.
Yeah,
Or the new
yeah,
brace.
just got back after 2 weeks of
Wow.
surgery 2 weeks ago, big plate.
Well,
But-
last week the Alaska Stalker, one of our columns, wrote, Kurka no longer has a running mate.
Right,
As a
I
joke,
read
and
that.
all these people thought you dropped out. We had to say
No.
he broke his leg. It's a goof. It's a
Yeah.
goof.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, no, we don't quit that easy.
Well, no, we don't quit. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And I guess Paul's not a running mate now. He's a crutch man. I don't know.
I'm a crutch man.
Hobbling mate. Well, first I want to start with you, Christopher. You're a representative. You were elected in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
With redistricting, you got paired with David Eastman, so you were put in the same district. But I want to start asking why you're running for governor, and did that pairing have anything to do with that, or were you looking at doing this before that happened?
The question had come up beforehand of, pairing is certainly a factor, I have an oath of office to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States and the state of Alaska, as do all lawmakers. And so does the governor. And over the last 2 years, and it's more than the last 2 years, but it's like on steroids the last 2 years, we've seen the Constitution just thrown out. It's totally ignored. And we just become lawless. And we have to have the rule of law back in state government. We have to have a governor who is more concerned with following the law, following the Constitution, than he is with his own shadow.
So how did you get to pick Paul Hueper? How'd you find Paul, and why'd you pick him?
Yeah, so we met early on in the campaign trail. I met Paul and got to know him and loved him. And as you can tell, he's a fantastic guy.
Quite tall too. Huh?
But one of the big concerns that has been too often overlooked when picking a lieutenant governor candidate is they're looking for somebody who brings something to the ticket in terms of electability. And my big concern is governance. My big concern is election integrity. And the governor can do all he wants on election integrity. We can introduce legislation. We can do things with the budget. We can investigate with audits. But when it comes down to it, the staff work for the lieutenant governor when it comes to divisional elections. So I need somebody who is passionate about a free and fair vote going forward, and that we have to have election integrity. And Paul is extremely passionate about election integrity.
Now, Paul, some folks might know, but for the folks who don't know, you had that famous kind of the FBI raided your house in
Right.
Homer, thinking your wife was in a video for January 6th in D.C., and they thought you had Nancy Pelosi's laptop,
Right.
which is like kind of bizarre. So tell me about that. You guys were in D.C., but you weren't in the Capitol. You weren't in the Capitol, right?
Right. We were in D.C. January 6, 2020. Very passionate about election corruption that had taken place. I know most of the media said, no evidence, don't look here, but my wife and I studied the state legislatures all the way from Wisconsin to Pennsylvania, Arizona, and listened to all the testimony. We listened to hours and hours of testimony. We both were convinced there was a lot of evidence, including almost 1,000 signed affidavits about election corruption, the people that personally had witnessed and that they had signed off on a document saying, yes, this is what we've seen. So we both decided, you know what? We got the invitation to go to January 6th. Let's just go there. We don't have any intentions of being part of a movement per se or anything. We just wanted to witness what was going on. So yeah, we didn't even get within 100 yards of the Capitol.
So when they came to your house, what were you? It must have just been. Was there a lot of them? Were they armed?
There were 12. They were very armed. I came around the corner and heard FBI come out with your hands up, and I had 7 guns pointed right at my head. And I'm totally clueless why they're there. They immediately, put me into handcuffs. Of course, they couldn't put them in front of me. They obviously thought I was some sort of a terrorist, so they went ahead and put the handcuffs on behind me. And my wife was right behind me, 9 o'clock in the morning, and they did the same thing with her. We had 2 house guests that were with us. One of them was 17 years old, and they held him at gunpoint. So it was...
You guys on the Homer Inn and Spa.
Homer Inn and Spa, right. And so 4 hours of interrogation. For the first hour and a half, I had no idea what they were doing there.
That's what I was going to ask you. Did they tell you, or
no?
Nope. So you
refused to show us the warrant, which we had asked to see. And looking back at it now, we could have demanded this goes no further than you showing that search warrant. We're done. We need to, call up, get our legal advice and all of that given to us. We were ignorant, really, of what our rights were. And so they proceeded to snowball us. So
it took, eventually they found, I think a woman was in New York.
Right.
Who they were looking for.
Upstate.
And she kind of did look like your wife, but I didn't see it. I mean, it was similar, but to me, I was like, that's a big
it was
mistake
shoddy,
right there.
It was
huh?
shoddy police work, and here's what it is. It's tragic, but we've let the FBI become a political arm of the government. And instead of just pursuing justice, just pursuing criminals, I believe what this was about is coming all the way to faraway Homer, Alaska to tell conservatives, you need to shut up and sit down because there's no place on the planet we won't come to harass you. And it's kind of crazy, but you look at the warrant for breaking down their door and coming to their home. One of the justifications for coming into their house was that Marilyn was seen in the airport not fully wearing her mask.
That was on the warrant?
That was on the warrant as one of the issues, and it was kind of like...
So at some point, they must have told you, hey, you were in D.C., we think you have Pelosi's laptop, and what was your response? Like, that's great.
Well, after an hour and a half, all they do is basically pull out a picture book, flip through some pictures. Is this you? I'm like, yeah, that's me. Is this you here? Yeah, I'm standing here smiling with a guy who, I don't know who he was, but those are my pictures, and I had posted them on Instagram. I'm not a big social media guy, but I put a couple of pictures on. Hey, I was in D.C., and then they showed me pictures of my wife, and said, no, is this your wife here? I'm like, yeah, no, flipped another one. This is your wife inside the Capitol, right? I'm like, no, we never were inside the Capitol.
Wasn't there some weird fixation on the earlobes? Wasn't that?
Right, well, Marilyn...
They kept talking about earlobes.
Right. To know her is to love her. She's savvy. She's smart.
I met her when you guys had your kickoff event.
That's right,
there.
yeah.
Wasilla there.
And so she, as they're interrogating her, they let her know a lot sooner in the game than they did with me. They kept me in the dark. But with her, right away they said, okay, we know you're inside the Capitol. We know you're inside of Nancy Pelosi's office. We know this is you. And they're showing her pictures. And so she reaches over and grabs a picture and holds it up and goes, her, me. Her, me. She's got detached earlobes. I've got attached earlobes. I already hate her because my whole life I've wanted detached earlobes.
And didn't she say too something about she would never wear that jacket or she would never wear that outfit or something?
The woman from New York is wearing this really ugly sweater.
Yeah, it's a sweater.
And my wife is like, look at this sweater. I would never wear something this ugly.
Well, it was a wild story. I mean, it was kind of, everybody was talking about it when it happened. It was kind of the big story. Mm-hmm. And it is pretty amazing when the government decides they want to, they have a lot of power.
And Chris is right. Whether or not Nancy Pelosi's laptop even exists, we don't know. They can tell us anything they want to tell us. And frankly, I don't believe a word that the FBI would ever share with me now. I mean, my trust in government went from a moderate level. Yeah, there's some bad players in. So I don't trust any of the ABC mafia anymore. I mean, they really have got it out for conservatives. We were this close to going to a DC jail. They had already planned on arresting us. One of the officers had walked up to Marilyn as she was being interrogated and said, have you read her Miranda rights yet? And the guy hung his head, who is the lead guy out of DC. Decent guy, but still violated our rights just the same, but he's just shook his head and said, we're not going there. Now, if we had been sent there, we could still be sitting in that DC jail with no rights, 22 hours of solitary confinement, as they have a bunch of guys in there right now that are still under solitary confinement, cannot get a court date. And you talk about the ultimate violation of our human civil rights in America. I never thought I'd see that day where human beings, my fellow citizens, have every right stripped away from them.
Yeah, I mean, lately several have been sentenced. It's ongoing,
Yeah.
but it's fortunate they figured out it wasn't her, because
Yeah,
it's a wild
I know.
wild story.
Yeah.
Well, I want to ask you guys. There's 10 tickets for governor, 5 of which are kind of raising money. There's the Dunleavy, Dahlstrom, Garrett Cook, and then Walker Drygas. They're raising quite a bit of money. Kind of the main candidates, but there's this top 4 primary now, and really it's you guys and then Pierce Grunwald, Republican ticket as well, that are competing for the 4th position to move on to the general in November. What and there's the governor's Republican, Pierce Republican, you guys are Republican. There's I think 1 or 2 other, maybe 2 other Republican tickets. But what's your kind of strategy for getting to that 4th spot for the general?
Well, I think you've seen some of it. We've been traveling around the state, meeting with Alaskans, actually campaigning, talking with folks. Money is incredibly important in a campaign because it's one of the tools you use to communicate with folks. You got to buy ads. You got to send them mail. You got to whatever it is to communicate with voters. You can't do that unless you're knocking on their door or sending them something in the mail or going to their meeting, and that all costs money. But in my campaigning experience, we've learned to spend money very efficiently, and we know how to stretch those dollars. And so we've been traveling around the state, meeting with folks everywhere, and even during session, I was traveling around the state, even though we couldn't raise funds. And we have supporters all over the state. It's been quite humbling, actually.
Now you guys are a Republican ticket. The governor, Dunleavy, is an incumbent Republican. You've been really critical in Juneau on some of the COVID stuff going on with the Department of Health and Social Services. I guess what's the main reason or reasons you've gotten the race and are challenging an incumbent Republican when you're a Republican?
Yeah, well, I think, a lot of us, when Dunleavy ran, were excited about some of his promises. And when I ran for House, we ran on a similar platform, a conservative platform of cutting state government. It's incredibly huge. Standing up for the full statutory dividend, following the law, protecting the preborn, a whole host of mainstream Republican values that the governor ran on. And when he got into office, he started doing some of those things. But pretty quickly, he ran into opposition, and he forgot that in politics, you work across the aisle as much as you can, but when it comes down to it, you have an obligation to fulfill the campaign promises that you ran on. That's what you're fighting for, and he forgot about that. And there's a lot of frustration. And beyond that, I don't think any of us imagined that we'd have a Republican governor who would shut churches down. That we'd have a Republican governor who would say your business is essential and yours is not. That we'd have a Republican governor that would appoint a health czar that takes a one-sided approach to health care and will not even tolerate any kind of early treatments or anything other than one approach, the jab for COVID. And it's incredibly wrong.
Now you mentioned the dividend, and I want to ask you about the Senate passed due to kind of somebody being gone. Senator Von Imhoff was gone. They ended up passing this kind of mega $5,600 dividend, and it went back to the House for a concurrence vote, which is almost unheard of. I think the last time that happened was 1982 when the other body agreed with the budget version from the other side. There was a big push to concur with the Senate's budget to get that big dividend, the full dividend plus even some back pay. But there was also some language in the budget about abortion funding. You voted against the concurrence. It was, I think, 20 votes, 22 to 18, so it needed 21, so it was pretty close. Can you talk about why you voted against the concurrence, which would have, if it would have passed, it would have guaranteed that much bigger diviend?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. So on the full dividend, the legislature in my short term has voted 33 times on either the full statutory dividend or some sort of increase. And I've either sponsored those measures and or voted for all of them. And sometimes in politics, people like to spin things like, oh, this is what this vote means. Well, this vote was on the entire budget. And when I ran for House, I won pointing out that my opponent had voted for some of the biggest budgets in state history. And my constituents wanted smaller government, not big budgets. And now before me comes the biggest budget in state history. Not to mention, twice now we have passed, when I was a legislator, as a state House rep, we've passed language banning abortion funding in the state budget. And that was stripped out by Senate Republicans. And that wasn't something I could endorse.
There has been several legal,
Yeah.
rulings in the courts where they've said that's not constitutional. So that was the thing people kind of got hung up on. Well, the courts are going to say this. Why not, vote for it to get the dividend? But you're right. The budget was very large.
Let me speak to that because that's a really good point that needs to be addressed because a lot of people are sort of confused on that. So there's a couple of points, and I don't want to go down the rabbit trail too much because we could spend hours. It's a fun topic, but so our state case law on abortion. There's 2 points here. One is that our state case law on abortion, the foundation is still Roe v. Wade. The idea that privacy equals abortion was destroyed with the new Alito decision. And we saw that coming. And so in my discussions behind the scenes with attempting to discuss, the governor would never meet with us. But when I met with the staff, kind of the point we're trying to make is, look, I don't care how he does this. The legislatures consistently said we don't want to pay for abortions. Alaskans have consistently said that. And, even if you believe in judicial supremacy, which I don't, we'll get into it in a second, there's an opening here where the foundation, the rug that all of Alaska's state Supreme Court case law on abortion is resting on has been destroyed. There's no case. And so there's not this requirement. Furthermore, I would point out, and this is kind of where I think you'll find me very different from almost any other candidate running for governor, sadly, or even the legislature. And that is this. I don't believe in judicial supremacy. My oath of office is very clearly to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States and the state of Alaska. And as governor, add to that is the faithful execution of the laws. So we have these separate branches of government, and the legislative branch is the most powerful branch of government. It's got the power of lawmaking and the power of the purse. These are incredibly important, and it's very powerful, and that's why we separate it into a bunch of hands. We don't want a few people to have this power. We want it to be dysfunctional.
But we do have the check and balance. So
right.
If they pass something kind of that violates the Constitution or that's just way out there, there is the check of the judicial system, and then there's also the governor can veto things. So there's all these checks and balances that without them, it could be really, awry.
Well, that's the current idea of checks and balances, but it's not actually what was intended. So what I was getting to is that the legislature has the power of the purse. It's an incredibly important power. It's huge, and you don't want to give it to a couple judges. But what we've done is we've let the judiciary take over the power of lawmaking. We've let the judiciary take over the power of the purse, and now they're trying to take over the power of the veto. And the courts have a very important role in government, but legislating and appropriating for the bench is not one of them. So we look at the U.S. Constitution. There's nothing in the U.S. Constitution requiring a chief executive to enforce a Supreme Court ruling. We look at the state Constitution. Not only is there nothing requiring it, in Article 3, Section 16, it's very clear that the responsibility to enforce a Supreme Court ruling is optional.
Isn't it like inherently that we have this court system? It's almost inherent that if they have the ability to, rule on things, laws, then
we're taught that in law school, but that's not what the Constitution says. It's optional in the Constitution. In the Federalist Papers, I think it was Hamilton was writing in number 74 or 78. I get them mixed up, and I'm going to paraphrase here. But he said that the courts are the weakest branch of government because they depend on the chief executive for the usurpation of power. So I have a responsibility to read the Constitution. Okay? So if the courts came out tomorrow and said, and this is going to sound far-fetched, but just bear with me for a second. If the courts came out tomorrow and said, women are non-persons, okay? I, as governor, would not enforce that because it's clearly in violation of the Constitution.
Well, the courts wouldn't just say something. Somebody has to bring something to the court. They have to bring a case, or they have to bring they have to bring a lawsuit. So they don't just come out and...
Regardless of the path to get there, what is the check and balance on the courts? And one of the checks and balances pointed out in the Federalist Papers is the power of enforcement. So that's why if you look at our Day 1 agenda, one of my commitments is I'm going to end the payments to Planned Parenthood. And the courts can sue, the Planned Parenthood, the ACLU can sue again, and the courts will rule against us likely, and we'll say, go pound sand. You can't make me write checks. It's interesting. Before statehood.
That's when things get really intense.
Yeah. Well, we have people say that's a constitutional crisis, but the constitutional crisis is now because the courts have stepped over their boundaries and are telling the state how to spend money. Before statehood, Governor Nick Stepovich and the legislature were funding the busing of kids to both private Catholic schools and public schools in Fairbanks, where it was cold out. And the courts ruled against them, said there was a suit, there was a ruling, said it was unconstitutional. The legislature and the governor got together and said, that's nice, we're going to do it anyways. And here we have a situation, we're not trying to fund something, we're trying to not fund something.
Well, speaking of the Constitution, I want to ask about I'll start with you, Paul, the Constitutional Convention questions on the ballot this year. It's on every 10 years. There's been it's not really been a big campaign issue yet, but I have a feeling it's going to be.
Yeah.
There's a group that's formed so far that's opposing it. There's people have different reasons. There's the judicial system, there's the dividend, there's the privacy issue. Where are you on this Constitutional Convention question?
Good people on both sides of the issue. So it's not an issue of their character, what they believe, and where they're going to stand on it. Personally, I feel we would have to wait another 10 years if we passed up this opportunity for a constitutional convention. And a lot of my conservative friends are like, we can't take a risk on what could happen on that. But my point is, we can't take a risk and let another 10 years go by, allowing especially the judicial branch, allowing them to continue to guard the henhouse. Alaska is the only state that I'm aware of that the bar actually picks the candidates to go forward that the governor picks from. Okay, so you've got the Alaska Bar Association guarding the henhouse. Of course, they're going to put forward the people that they feel fits their motive, whatever they feel is best for them. So therefore, the governor sits there and looks at, I've got these people given to me. I don't like any of them, but I have to appoint somebody to the Supreme Court.
Well, we saw that in 2019. The governor Dunleavy didn't want to appoint somebody, and that became quite a
it's a mess.
It was Frank Murkowski as well, I believe.
It's happened
for a minute,
times,
he almost didn't appoint somebody.
Chris, I'll go to you. Where are you at on the Constitutional Convention question?
I got mixed feelings like Paul. There's some things that need to be fixed, like the way we appoint judges. To put it more succinctly, we have a private lawyers club that has a controlling interest in who becomes a judge in Alaska.
We have the council, which is the governor picks some members, the bar, I guess the lawyers have some members, and then there's the tiebreaker, the chief justice, which there's not that many ties actually. I've looked back. There's only been a few ties. Usually it's pretty unanimous. But yeah, they send the names to the governor, which is much different than most states, where many states judges are elected.
Right.
And we have a whole different kind of this Missouri plan they call it.
It's a mess. It's a mess.
So I don't think it's a good system. I know the intent was to keep politics out of the judiciary, but I kind of think that's like trying to keep water from going downhill. It can't be done. I think direct accountability. One of the things that I think would be better about a direct election over the retention system we have. The retention system is extremely infrequent, but also with retention, like when you go to vote on judges this November, or say last election cycle, what did you know about the judges you're voting on?
Most people, I don't think knew much. I know a little bit because I follow politics, close, but for the most part, I don't think most folks know.
Most people have no idea. See, in politics,
we have
this beautiful thing of competition, and when you have somebody running against you, they have a selfish incentive to point out your record.
The check is the council of it looks at all the judges, and if they find there's a reason not to retain them, they'll come out, and that's happened a few. It's pretty rare. And then there was the Michael Corey one years ago. That was kind of the famous one on that Schneider guy with the woman that he kidnapped, and they didn't like the ruling, and he was not retained, which I think was the first time a judge who was recommended for retention didn't get retained.
Right.
Michael Corey, that was a big, that was in that case everybody knew that guy.
Yeah.
There was a kind of big organized campaign. But yeah, you're right. Most people couldn't name maybe even one judge, if you asked them. Most,
right.
Average kind
of
voters.
But they're also not going to be familiar with their rulings, or how they rule from the bench, or how they conduct themselves.
Well, I want to ask you. You touched on it before, but if you win, if you prevail, Paul, you'll be heading up elections, and you mentioned some. You have some thoughts on the election system. Now there was a lot of court cases. There's been a lot of folks talking about the election. I mean, so do you think there was like fraud all over the place, or was it targeted, or like where are you at on the kind of election integrity for the country? And then if you're in charge of this system, you're the one all of a sudden who has to oversee the elections and make sure they're conducted fairly.
I think we've got a mess. I don't want to sound conspiratorial, but I have followed wherever the evidence leads. That's where I want to go. Dinesh D'Souza came out with a movie called 2000 Mules.
Well, you guys did a screening, didn't you?
We've been doing all over the state.
And I have yet to hear somebody be able to effectively pick that apart. And I'm open to the evidence. Somebody could tell me where they're off on that, okay, I'm good to go. But it's pretty compelling.
There's
when I
been
see
some,
that.
Ben Shapiro, they talked about it. I mean, basically, if you haven't seen it, they took the phones, the data on the phones and
Right.
drop boxes, and they're trying to make a connection of how many, I guess, what are they called? Ballot harvesting, I guess,
Yeah.
people that are picking up ballots. But
And I'm not saying
it's
that's
been, there's been a lot of discussion about it.
not necessarily saying that's happening in Alaska, but Alaska is using Dominion voting machines, which, in my viewpoint, again, after having studied it extensively, can be
They
manipulated.
can be hacked.
We continue. Dunleavy went out and purchased a bunch. Charlie Pierce, under his borough leadership, picked up a bunch. I'm not saying these are corrupt guys. I'm just saying these are not the same voting systems my grandfather, my father, my great-grandfather, whatever used. I'm a little bit old school on this. We need to go back to hand counting.
You guys aren't a fan of the Dominion. You guys had a kind of fundraiser gimmick where it wasn't an actual Dominion machine, but it was like an old printer or something, and you could, Dominion was slapped on it, and you could
We had some fun.
take a baseball bat. It's like the Office Space. Have you seen Office Space when they take the printer out to the field and they?
I think I heard about that one.
Yeah, it's kind of similar. Well, it is a question of, lately we saw this in 2020, and obviously it was COVID, and there was a lot of mail absentee votes. But and I've brought this up with several people I've talked to. If you look at these elections in Europe, these big elections for countries, you kind of know the same day or the next day.
Yeah.
And in a lot of states, Florida, they've been doing absentee for a long time. They have a lot of older people, but we it took us 3 weeks last time
Oh,
to know who won some of these races. And,
Yeah, it was nuts.
And we didn't even. I think we were the last state to be called for president. Because there was
Which is silly, and that's part of the concern. Is because, okay, look, we're 4 hours behind the East Coast. We get that, and it's frustrating that you're still voting when people are calling other states. But we're a little state in population. That has never happened where we couldn't call Alaska for weeks and weeks and weeks before. And there's several issues, and Paul and I could go on for hours about it. But one of the things, and I criticized the governor and the lieutenant governor pretty heavily. We did this vote by mail scheme for the congressional race. Well, vote by mail is an invitation for fraud because you're mailing out ballots to every person registered on the Division of Elections list to vote, and that list is notoriously bad. I mean, just the back of the napkin math from the government's own numbers, from the Census Bureau and the state registration numbers, there's a minimum 60,000 people on the rolls that don't exist. And Senator Showers, I think, pointed out.
I mean, they're like dead or.
Well, what happened is people move to Alaska. We have a very transient population. They move to Alaska. They register to vote and they move out and they don't count the registration.
But sometimes they're military, sometimes they're in college, sometimes they're.
Right.
So this is the question. I've brought this up before. How do we, if you move somewhere and that's where you want to be, as long as you're not registered somewhere else, and a lot of military, if you're registered, there's a system called ERIC, which most states are part of, and they should
Right.
flag.
They should.
You can't be registered in two places, but a lot of people, especially military, they like being registered in Alaska. No income tax. They get the dividend. So there is and we have, like you said, we have a big military population. So there is a lot of military who they're here for 3 or 4 or 5 years. They leave, and then their intent is to come back.
Right.
And, my view is honestly, and I've talked about this. I don't know if those people should be getting dividends. If you're gone for 20 years,
no.
maybe put it into an account and see if you come back. Well. But that is a big reason, the dividend, and then also the not paying the income tax. So there are people that aren't here, but are registered here, and it's really hard to say, we're going to take you off the roll.
These folks I'm talking about aren't even voting. The folks I'm talking about, they register to vote, they leave the state, and they go register somewhere else, and they're never cleaned from the voter rolls because the ERIC system doesn't work. It's a joke.
Well, in that case, they absolutely should be taken off. And there probably is. I'd love to know the exact numbers, but I'm sure there is some of that.
So I haven't done the math after this recent purge, but before this recent purge in March, it was 113% of Alaska's voting age population was registered to vote. And when I did the back of the napkin math on after the purge, considering the purge, there was a minimum 60,000 people on the voter rolls that was greater than those who were eligible to vote in population. And Senator Showers pointed out it's probably close to 148,000. I think he's right. You look at these voter rolls, you have people on the rolls for maybe 30 years and they've never voted. And the Division of Election was hacked during the 2020 election, and it was concealed from us until after the election was certified. And the information that was stolen is the information you would need to fill out a ballot application. So we're not going to get rid of absentee voting, but we need to go to a system where there's actual reason for it.
No, Chris, you've been in June of the last 2 years. Paul, you've not been elected before. If you guys do prevail, we're going to have a lot of new legislators 25. It could be up to, depending on
Right.
some of the races, it could be half the legislature could be new. So, when you went down there the first time, we've seen the last 4 years, it takes them a month to organize. The numbers are so slim in the House. The current House majority is 21, and that's really, on any given day, it could be 20, depending on what one of their members is thinking.
Right.
But what do you think is going to happen next year with the House and the Senate with all these new legislators?
Yeah. I think it's really hard to say now because we don't have any idea how these elections are going to shake up in terms of. I'm very hopeful. A lot of the people are leaving that have been there so long. But, Alaskans are very angry, and they have a right to be. For the last 3 election cycles, they've elected a majority of Republicans to go down to Juneau and represent Republican values. And for 3 election cycles, that's not what's happened in the House. And, it's one of the tragic things, what I call the scum-sucking political types. They'll move into a community and say they're a lifelong Democrat, and they'll go, oh, I guess I'm a Republican now. And they don't believe in representing the values of their community, but that's just how you get elected. And so a lot of those folks got taken out by voters in 2020. But there's still a few left.
Paul, I want to ask you, what do you think about this new system, this open primary ranked choice? I mean, this is folks still trying to navigate it, not just the candidates, but the voters. What are your thoughts about this?
I'm not a big fan. I think well, first of all, just the basics of it, people are still really confused by it. And your average voter has to have the ability to discern, why am I going to the polls? How do I vote? What does this mean? The other system, although granted not perfect, it was understandable. You go, you represent, or you go to vote within the party that you've chosen. You pick the candidate that you want, and they just move forward into the finals. So here we've got a jungle primary where you just pile in the top 4 people and they move on. The fact that it's nonpartisan to me leaves a mess for the people to understand what's really going on. Now, if somebody took the time to really study it and go, okay, I get this. If my first choice doesn't show up, I can vote number 2. That goes here. I mean, you can take the time to study it. The average person, unfortunately, doesn't do that.
Well, I think a lot of people are trying to wrap their mind around it. And I've talked to a lot of my friends that are very smart, educated people, and they're asking me what I think. And I try to explain it, and it's just like really trying to wrap your mind around it, which is, if you guys prevail, it's going to be really interesting how all the 4 campaigns for all the races, the big statewide races, navigate it.
Yeah.
I just want to conclude with asking you guys, to start with you, Chris, what do you think the most important issue or issues are facing Alaska in the next 4 years?
There's so many issues. Freedom and liberty. And like I said, the Constitution. The opening words of the state Constitution say that this Constitution is dedicated to the principle that all persons have a natural right to life. We don't recognize that in the state for the preborn. So that's one of our top issues. But also one of our top issues is economic freedom and healthcare freedom. And one of the tragedies of Obamacare is we've limited choices. And now there's far fewer doctors who are independent and aren't working for some big conglomerate where the decisions are made based upon money, not based upon what's best for the patient. And that's a huge tragedy. We've lost a lot of our healthcare freedom. But also economic freedom. Alaska's been ranked 50th in the country in 2021. And I think we might have come up to 49th. Woohoo. It's unacceptable. This is supposed to be the last frontier, north of the future. But we have all the regulations and permitting of a left-wing dystopian city. And we're bleeding population. We're bleeding in private sector workers. And it's because of our hostile attitude towards private investment, towards private industry. Our governor's been ranked 14th worst for economic freedom. And I didn't even realize how bad it was until I went around the state talking to business owners, talking to Alaskans, talking to farmers. We've gone from 50% of our food production, our food consumption in Alaska being grown here to now 5%. And it's federal overreach. And our campaign's all about standing up to federal overreach and actually interposing and standing in the way of the federal government. But also it's our own state bureaucrats. And we have to get the bureaucrats working for the people and not against them.
Paul, what were your major issues going forward in the next 4 years?
I can't overlook freedom, maybe from a little different angle than Chris is looking at it. We have lost so many freedoms in the last few years that I never thought I'd see in my lifetime, where I couldn't drive from Homer to Kenai legally, where my church was shut down. Unthinkable under any situation. The rights that have been given to us, guaranteed to us by the first, second, third, fourth Bill of Rights, the amendments and so forth, were just flat out violated. Now I can look at all the issues of election integrity. Yeah, I'm upset about a lot of those things. But really the urgency of the moment right now, I don't think the average Alaskan necessarily gets it. They understand that their rights have been taken away. They understand that their dividend has been stolen from them, a lot of things. But for me, that we need to understand the urgency of the moment. And George Washington said that basically, pick today. Do you want to be a free person or do you want to be a slave? He understood the oppression of King George in England at the time. I don't think the average American, average Alaskan understands the edge of losing our freedoms that we're at right now. There's an urgency to the moment that I don't hear Mike Dunleavy talking about. I don't hear Charlie Pierce talking about it. We see the urgency of where we're at. We're at a precipice as a country. Do we want to continue on the way that we're going and become a Venezuela? And you can say that can't happen. Yeah, right. The Venezuelans felt that. The Cubans felt that. Who are we as Americans to think that we're not on a precipice and it can't possibly happen?
Well, I've always given the example of Yugoslavia in the 1980s. It was very prosperous. They had the Olympics in Sarajevo, and
yeah,
it was
the
great,
Olympics there just a few years before.
And then 10 years later, it was full on civil war.
Yeah.
I mean, it was destroyed. The city was destroyed, and
Yeah.
I will agree. I mean, we probably disagree on some of the the vaccination and that, but I mean, I was very openly kind of against this mask mandate stuff. And
Yeah.
it is kind of crazy how, whether it's the airplanes or buildings or whatever, just how many people would just kind of went along with it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, it was just the mandate comes in and
Oh,
once
yeah.
once in a while somebody might, but then, they go to jail, they get arrested potentially. And it's just really, when you think about it, how many people just were okay with wearing the mask
Yeah.
and wouldn't question it.
All right.
And I'm sure they might marginally do something if you wear them correctly and all that, but there's the fact that the airplanes, and everybody just, it's like this ruling happens, and I'm very happy. I was very, very happy when the judge ruled.
Did it bother you in that whole process that the message from the airlines and the message from the federal government is it's federal law?
Well, yeah, that's how they were able to enforce it. I mean, the CDC
there was no law passed.
There wasn't. It was that's what the judge in Florida. They said this was over. This was overreach. This was
right.
not.
So Congress never passed a law, and that's one of the frustrating things. We've come to a place where we've lost the value of the rule of law, and now the determination in politics is not. This is my biggest frustration with the legislature and the governor, really, when it comes down to it. It's not what are we allowed to do within the bounds of the Constitution or the law. It's what can I get away with politically.
Even we were there in Juneau. The legislature closed the building. Early on, okay, I think there was a few months where let's see what's going on here. But the next year it was closed, and then there was the masking, and there was there was very when you do push back, and I push back on the masks, people come at you like you're crazy.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's.
Oh yeah, it was tyrannical.
Total. I mean, when that judge ruled on that Florida judge,
I know.
it was
a breath of fresh air.
It was amazing. They were even in flight. They were announcing it. There were some videos. They
People
said,
throwing them and dance. Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. Congress never passed a law. They actually tried to pass. There was a lot of senators trying to pass a law to stop it,
Right.
and they couldn't even do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
the truth is that our rights are under attack. They're under attack by the guy that's occupying the White House. They're under attack by Congress, and we have to have a governor who's willing to stand up. And I applaud the governor on some of his lawsuits he signed on to, but here's a huge difference in approach between a Kurka administration and a Dunleavy administration. So we'll just use resource development as an example. We're going to have our own environmental protection agency bureaucrats come and look at a project and do studies. And if the project, with a road project, mining, oil development, whatever it is, if we determine that it's safe for Alaska, because look, we live here, we don't want to destroy the environment. If we determine we can do that project safely, then we're going to do it. And I'm going to tell the Army Corps of Engineers and the EPA to go pound sand because they don't possess the constitutional authority to tell us how to do business. And that's when it comes to healthcare with masks, when it comes to resource development, when it comes to farming. You name the issue, we're going to stand and protect Alaskans.
Well, it's going to be a busy upcoming 2 weeks. The primary is August 16th. I want to thank you, Representative Kurka, Christopher Kurka, and Paul Hueper for coming in and talking to us.
Thank you.
Early,
Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you guys. Early voting started a couple days ago, August 1st, and the August 16th primary is a few weeks away. And I want to again thank Christopher Kurka and Paul Hueper for coming in. We've interviewed a few of the other candidates. We're going to be interviewing all the kind of top candidates for governor here, and then we're going to be doing our Elections Central live coverage on August 16th. So tune in for more updates. And I want to thank again GCI. I want to thank GCI for being our main sponsor for making interviews like this possible. So thanks, and stay tuned for our next interview.